First Minister for that answer. So if I'm understanding this correctly, according to the amendments that were published yesterday, even if the Scottish Parliament expressly refuses consent, so let's say every single MSP in this place votes against having its hands tied by Westminster on matters to do with fishing or the environment or GM crops, the UK government could take that express refusal as the green light that it needs to go ahead and impose these restrictions anyway. Surely no party that has any respect for this Parliament or for the devolution settlement could sign up to that.
First Minister.
Well, Ash Denham is right in her interpretation, and, well, look, the amendments are public. Every member of this chamber, and I hope before there is any vote on this, every member of this chamber will pay close attention to these amendments. It is not a requirement under these amendments for the UK Government to obtain our consent. It is simply a requirement for them to allow us to make a consent decision, but a consent decision could include a decision by this Parliament to refuse consent. So if we say no, they can go ahead and do it anyway. That's a pretty strange definition of consent, and not one that I have previously been familiar with.
So no matter where it takes hold, government of the people and by the people sets a single standard for all who would hold power. You must maintain your power through consent, not coercion.
America was founded on liberty and independence, and not government coercion, domination, and control. We are born free, and we will stay free.
You must respect the rights of minorities and participate with a spirit of tolerance and compromise. You must place the interests of your people and the legitimate workings of the political process above your party. Without these ingredients, elections alone do not make true democracy.
I want to start off by explaining why it is that I would support this principle of the states being able to protect themselves against overreach by the federal government. Now, there are a lot of people who believe in this because they believe in the U.S. Constitution. And they say the U.S. Constitution clearly delineates the apportionment of powers, the delegation of powers from the states to the federal government. This is made clear. You can see it in Article 1, Section 8, and you can see it in the 10th Amendment. And we want to preserve this balance. And I fully understand and respect that position, and I've argued that position in my book, Nullification. But there's something to me more fundamental than the question of the Constitution. Because whether or not there was a Constitution, we would still favor liberty, the cause of liberty. And my own philosophy is the libertarian view of non-aggression, that you should not commit aggression against other people. You should leave peaceful people alone. It's a very simple thing. It's something you learn when you're a kid. You know, don't punch that other kid. Don't take that other kid's toys. These are the sorts of things we learn as children. And then as we grow into adulthood, we learn all the exceptions to these rules. But as a libertarian, we kind of say, well, wait a minute, you know, my mom was pretty on top of things, and she wasn't telling me there were a whole lot of exceptions to this. Well, if the guy's wearing a special hat, it's okay for him to take the stuff, or he's got an official-looking uniform, well, then there's not much you can do. So my view is just strict non-aggression. And it's my view that government, on the other hand, constantly engages in aggression. In everything it does. I mean, if we're talking about taxation as being legal plunder, as Bastiat said, that's government engaged in aggression. Government, in my view, encourages conflict between groups, because whenever government does something, it inherently favors one group at the expense of others. So it can help one demographic group, one age group at the expense of others, one region at the expense of others, one industry at the expense of others, and it pits us all against each other in a kind of low-intensity civil war. It squanders resources, it makes us poorer, and it perverts every concept it touches. For instance, think about the way government thinks of consent. Now, when you and I think of consent, we think that means that in order for a transaction to occur, both parties have to agree to it. So in order for a marriage to be considered valid, for example, you need the free will, the consent of the would-be spouses. You can't have one forcing his view on the other and calling that consent. For example, when we buy a house, we make clear that the buyer wants the house and the seller wants to sell the house to him, and we fill out a lot of forms indicating I want the house. When you go to buy a car, if you take out a loan to buy a car, you fill out a lot of forms indicating that you are going to make such and such payment every single month and you agree to this. That's how we indicate consent. We normal people indicate consent. But how does the government get the idea that we've consented to what it's doing? Does it send us a form to fill out indicating our consent? With the government, I mean, we're sending them, 30% of our income. And then at different levels, when you add in all the other kinds of taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, the taxes in hotels, the taxes on parking, you add all that up, it's kind of a lot. And this is a lifelong commitment that we have to the government, even more important than a car loan. And for a car loan, you fill out 27 documents. But yet, with the government, I never filled out anything. They never sent me a document because they're afraid I might not sign it. So they say that it's consent anyway. But how could it be? Like, you never even asked me. You never even bothered to ask. They say, well, it's sort of consent because, look, you're still here. You haven't moved away. So that means you agree to everything. And there are people on the internet, by the way, they think this is a really strong argument. Yeah, man, you haven't moved away, so that proves that you agree to it. So I have to move away now to prove that I don't agree? Like, when did this moral principle get introduced? Well, you're still on the playground, so that means you consent to that bully. What parent says that to his kid? Even the idea of representation takes on a different hue under government influence. In ordinary civil society, the classic example of representation is an agent. The agent gets instructions from the principal. I say to my agent, here's my manuscript, go pitch it to these publishers and see what they say. And he does it. He represents me. He does what I ask, he represents me. But what does representation mean in government? I grew up in Massachusetts. I have never been represented in my entire life, is what I felt like when I was living there. Because my so-called representative, every single thing that person did was the exact opposite of what I would do. What kind of sick world are we in which this is called representation? If this were my agent, I would have fired him years ago. How can it be representation when the agent doesn't even know most of the principals? And most of the principals disagree among themselves. The concept of representation is meant to conceal the brute fact that some people rule and others are ruled. The old Harvard philosopher Robert Nozick had this interesting allegory, and he called it the tale of the slave. And I'll give you the condensed version. He says, let's imagine that we got a slave, and the slave is ruled over by a terrible, cruel master who whips him and mistreats him and exploits him terribly. We all agree that's morally wrong. Forced labor at the end of a whip, that's morally wrong. Well, let's suppose the master sees the error of his ways and decides not to use the whip, but still forces the guy to be a slave. Well, we still think that's pretty terrible. Right? We still don't support that. Well, then suppose he says, well, you know what? I'm going to allow you to take 2 days off. You can have the weekend. Be a slave the other 5 days. We would still say, the principle of the thing is still a problem. It's still there. What if he said, you know what? You can have 4 days off. You have to be a chattel slave only 3 days of the week. What are you complaining about? Only 3 days a week. We would still say, I think you're still not seeing the basic idea of what's wrong here. Now, what if he said, look, I'm not even going to make you work for me. Now I release you into society, but every week you have to send me a check for the equivalent of 3 days of your labor. Oh, now a gasp emerges from the room, because that sounds a little bit like what we do. And so what Nozick says after he goes through all the various steps is, when did this stop being the tale of a slave? So I look at the federal government and I think, well, this is the opposite of everything I believe in. So how can I keep this thing at bay? One way that Jefferson believed in, and others, was that if political power exists, you break it up into little units. You break it up into little bits. Jefferson was not some Enlightenment optimist who thought that human beings could be trusted with political power. It was precisely because he feared they couldn't be trusted with it that he wanted it broken up into bits, that he didn't believe that checks and balances, like we learned in the 3rd grade, was enough to keep government limited. I mean, why would it? Checks and balances between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, there's no reason that that would keep government limited. It might keep some abuses from occurring, but as Jefferson warned in 1825, what do we do when all 3 branches gang up on the public? Well, I wonder what he would think about what's going on in the year 2014.